House of the Dragon Episode 7 changes things in ways you might not realize. The episode opens with Rhaenyra accusing Adam of Hull of taking a dragon of House Targaryen. You know, there's the sense of being a thief, because a big theme in this episode is the social politics of dragons. Lord Celtigar is outraged, saying, you know, the lowborn can't go around seizing dragons. Jace is enraged, calling all these people mongrels, and Rhaenyra herself is actually skeptical when Mysaria first suggests using the bastards, using the dragon seeds, because she says that in the older houses and the greater houses there is a sense of fealty, of honor, that there's something in them, in their actual blood, that makes them more deserving of dragons. Dragons aren't just a status symbol, they're kind of like an outer reflection of your supposed inner character. And this is really interesting because this is something we actually see all throughout history, that the ruling class, the aristocrats, paints themselves as not just ruling over the commoners because they're, you know, got the wealth and the power and the circumstance, but because they're naturally better people. There's this old Chinese creation myth which talks about how the lords and the aristocrats are made from literally better material than the commoners are, making them more intelligent, or as Rhaenyra says, honorable, that they're closer to the gods, chosen by them in some way. But of course, it isn't true. This is a mythology to reinforce the social taboos and classism, but it goes deeper than that. You know, houses like the Celtigars, the Velaryons, and of course the Targaryens have the blood of old Valyria. This is this ancient empire ruled by dragon riders in Essos around here. It fell apart in this devastating magical apocalypse called the Doom of Valyria, which the Targaryens managed to avoid. And the Targaryens have long used their bond with dragons to say, oh, we don't just rule because we have control of the medieval nuclear weapons, but because something in our blood makes us literally better, more noble, more suited to ruling. Drawing this connection between the dragons and the gods, they can see that, they can look into someone's inner character. It's why in this episode Rhaenyra says over and over, the gods did this, you know, the gods brought us together. But one of the dragon keepers points out, you know, no, the gods did not do this, you did this. You put this all before yourself, and you're kind of using this as a framing to justify, you know, your power and what you're doing. But this is why the dragon seeds create an interesting problem for Rhaenyra and the Targaryens. Because as Jace points out, House Targaryen is the blood of the dragon. If any may lay claim to it, then what does that make us? Are we no different to them? Does our ability to control the dragons really just come down to like who bangs who? That's why the Targaryens have been so into the whole incest thing for their entire history. They want to believe there's some kind of justice to this system, but they're sort of intentionally destroying the careful illusion they've constructed around themselves that they even genuinely believe in, though we can see that maybe Rhaenyra is starting to doubt that. And Vermithor deciding to burn and eat half the people brought before him is a sore reminder that, like Viserys warned, they don't really control the dragons. The dragons are their own beings. They've been showing more and more agency in House of the Dragon than any of the histories would like to suggest. They kind of want to reduce them down to the pets of House Targaryen, who are, you know, perfectly controlled, but they're their own things. Targaryens want people to believe they control the dragons more than they do for propaganda purposes. And this belief, by the way, extends to the dragon keepers, this monk-like order who kind of train and work with the dragons. In the books, they're described as having this black armor, kind of themed like a dragon. It's real cool. But I suppose the armor's probably not going to help much against the dragons, and so the sort of monk outfits probably fits more for the show. And they refuse to take part in this whole ordeal with the dragon seeds because they see it as kind of like blasphemy. There's a religious reverence to them, not only towards the dragons, which they see as kind of the last vestiges of the magic of old Valyria, this grand empire, but also the Dragon Lords themselves, the Targaryens. They see them as close to the gods, and their duty is to serve that order. They mythologize this kind of slave empire from the past in a similar way that we often mythologize like the Roman Empire. Either way, we have to wonder what will be the implications of people realizing that dragons are just meat, that Targaryens are just mortals who happen to be born into the right gene pool. And we've seen the common people, you know, starting to see that as well. What are they going to do with it? But for Jace, this whole thing is very personal as well. You know, he talks to Rhaenyra. He's like, did you know I would have black hair? That's why people accused me of being a bastard, of not being a real true-born Targaryen. But the reason I was able to say I am, the whole reason that I was able to say, no, I am the true heir to the throne, no, I am who I claim to be, I can live up to that legacy, is because I have a dragon. Jace has invested so much of his identity is wrapped up in proving himself the true-born Targaryen prince and leaving behind this label of bastard, contending with that in society. But now, who is he? Westeros has a big taboo against bastard, kids born outside of marriage. In the books, Lord Celtigar is quoted saying, "Bastards are treacherous by nature," he said. It's in their blood. Betrayal comes as easily to a bastard as loyalty to true-born men. But there's also a deeper irony to the realizations of this episode. We learn that Hugh, one of the bastards who eventually bonds with Vermithor, is the son of Saera Targaryen. So, who is Saera, you might be wondering? Saera is the kind of long-lost, rebellious daughter of Jacaerys, the king we saw at the start. She was King Viserys' auntie. Now, you might know King Jacaerys, great king, had a very fruitful career as king, but not so fruitful career as a father. He had like 13 children, but only 9 of them ever made it to adulthood, and many of them, including his heirs, suffered terrible fates. Saera was one of the ones who survived, but she is described as a trial from the start, tempestuous, demanding, disobedient. The first word she spoke was no. She said it often and loudly. Fierce and stubborn, Saera Targaryen thrived upon attention and sulked when she did not receive it. She is described as being very clever, pulling pranks on her brothers and sisters, but intensely rebellious. And in her teens, she ends up kind of being sexually or romantically involved with a lot of men, but also women. And this is a big scandal. And again, we can see those different standards for men and women kind of echoing back through the generations. But this whole scandal ordeal ends with Jacaerys disowning his daughter. And in response, she runs away. She leaves Westeros forever and goes to Lys, this little city down in Essos, where she decides to work as a high-end prostitute, supposedly, building what she calls a kingdom of her own, famous and wealthy in her own right. And, in the show at least, she supposedly had Hugh, a kid. The irony being here that the bastard outcast of Jacaerys' disowned daughter claims Jacaerys' dragon, arguably the ultimate symbol of his authority and his authenticity as a Targaryen. Dragons have this kind of symbolic parallel in Targaryen myth. And again, we're seeing that be deconstructed, you know, that line between highborn and lowborn, between trueborn and bastard being blurred. And this is why there's a really interesting line from Alan Hull this episode, when he's talking to Corlys and he says, "My brother is ever restless, yearning for some sign of his worth. I am of salt and sea, I yearn for nothing else." This is a direct callback to a line from Baelor a few episodes back, where Corlys offers her the heirdom of Driftmark, be my heir, and she says no. She says, "I am fire and blood. Driftmark must pass to someone who is salt and sea." Corlys has spent his entire life building up the wealth and dignity and respect of House Velaryon, but he is unwilling to acknowledge the 2 bastard children he has. In the books, they're supposedly Laena Velaryons, but probably not. They're Corlys's. Even when Rhaenys pushed him to acknowledge them, that they should be raised up. Maybe one reason is that he thinks acknowledging his bastards will tarnish his reputation, tarnish the reputation of House Velaryon. And yet now, in pursuit of that, he finds himself without an heir. The person he offered it to rejected him. He's been searching for someone who will appreciate what he has built for his family, for House Velaryon, and he's finally got someone who is willing to live up to that. But can Corlys get over his prejudice, perhaps his ego? We'll have to see. This episode is soaked with people having to confront their prejudices and thinking around what makes someone honourable, worthy, highborn, lowborn, what it means to bear a name. And I really love that. But while I understand that some people think it might be a little bit slow, things are happening around Westeros, and I want to walk you through that. The Green Council talks of Lord Ormond Hightower leading an unstoppable army up from Old Town, but apparently it's currently being harassed on 2 fronts, they say. We don't know precisely what or where those are, but the books tell us that House Tarly and House Mullendore supported Rhaenyra, so potentially they're pressing in from the east while House Beesbury presses in from the west. We're also told in the books that House Greyshield of the Shield Islands and House Costain down on the coast also declare for Rhaenyra. What's interesting you should note here is that House Hightower might be one of the most powerful houses, perhaps in all of Westeros, but their vassals are turning on them. And you can see how difficult it would be to march an army through these lands when these houses control many of the critical points along the road to King's Landing, some of their most powerful vassals. We do finally get confirmation that Daeron Targaryen has joined the army with his electric blue dragon Velaryon, which will probably turn the tides of this battle and allow the Hightower army to move more quickly up towards King's Landing. Now you might be wondering, what the hell is House Tyrell doing? Aren't they like the Lords of the Reach? We've already got kind of confirmation for which sides the Lannisters, the Arryns, the Starks, the Riverlands, the Baratheons are on. What about the Tyrells? You'll find out. I'm sure, I don't want to spoil it. But we also have the Tullys finally arriving at Harrenhal, and the Lords of the Riverlands are gathering to discuss where to send their army, if to send it at all. Now, the world building of the Riverlands is very different to the other kingdoms in Westeros. If you're wondering why it's taken so long to draw them all together, it's because the Riverlands are situated in the middle of Westeros. They're bordered by almost everyone, so they're constantly invaded by the Lannisters and Baratheons and the Vale. They don't have natural borders like mountains to defend them easily, and a lot of their land is very flat, easy for armies to move through. But worse, they're always fighting amongst themselves. Unlike the Lannisters or the Starks or the Baratheons, we're told that House Tully doesn't have quite as firm a grip on its vassals. House Strong, which controls Harrenhal, is arguably more powerful. House Mouton is arguably richer. House Frey can sometimes summon more men than them. Others have older and nobler lineages. So even though House Tully is technically at the top of the Riverlands, it's harder for them to rule in the way that the Lannisters do in the Westerlands. There's a lot more negotiation and compromise, like you see in this episode. Though we are told in the books that this is about the time that the Tullys have kind of the apex of their power. The bottom line is this: we have 4 armies marching. You've got the Lannisters in the west, the Hightowers in the south, the Riverlands at Harrenhal, and the Starks in the north, all converging. But where, how bad will it be, and for who? We've also got supposedly the Baratheons and the Vale, but they haven't seemed to have committed an army just yet. We'll see how that turns out. But the big development of this episode is the new Dragon Riders, right? What was that about? What are you doing? You barking at a bird. The most important development of this episode is the new Dragon Riders. They radically change the balance of power.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
So let's talk about what that is. The Greens have Vhagar, Saerion, Dreamfire, and the Blacks have Syrax, Caraxes, Vermax,
as well as Moondancer.
And now, Seasmoke, Vermithor, and Silverwing. Now, you can debate how powerful each dragon is in the comments. I'm actually very curious to hear your thoughts, but a rough power ranking goes something a little bit like this, because you're not necessarily super familiar with these dragons. Vermax and Tessarion
and also Moondancer
are probably at the bottom. Then Syrax and Seasmoke, they're a little bit stronger. Then Dreamfire and Silverwing. And above them, Vermithor and Caraxes, and then at the very top, Vhagar by far. Who has the upper hand? I am very curious to hear your thoughts down below. It is worth noting that Team Black having more dragons may also mean that the other houses are more willing to send armies. We've seen that with the Vale and with the Lannisters, they're kind of unwilling to get involved unless they have a dragon moving with them. So who knows how that will turn out. The last thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite characters, Alicent. So she is starting to realize how kind of horrible and pointless and misguided all of this is, and her role in it. She goes out to the Kingswood, which is this big forest reserved for the crown, and she goes virtually alone, cutting herself off from the trappings of power. What is interesting is she's simultaneously making herself more vulnerable, being out in the open, far from the safety of the Red Keep, but this is also a scene of freedom. And potentially, it's a scene of leaving life behind. Alicent has spent her entire life kind of cooped up in this prison of duty and ladyship, protected and kind of coddled because she is the prize. But now she goes out into the wild, strips all of that away, just herself, to kind of ask, who am I without that. Alicent has a great line in this episode where she says, "Nothing is clean here." She looks around the Red Keep and she sees the blood and ash and responsibility of everything that has happened. Not only the moral rot and decay of her own family, but of everything she lived for and dedicated her life to, that she's had to believe is so important, is suddenly hollow. What do you do when everything that everyone told you your entire life mattered so much suddenly doesn't? What are you? Where does that leave you? I really love Alicent's character. I think she's been played brilliantly with this amazing emotional depth, and it's one of the best changes from the book to the show. In the books, she's kind of just this evil stepmother figure, but in the show, she's got some real depth and nuance and complexity that I love to see every time she's on screen. One last thing. It came to my attention after last episode that there's a lot of people who kind of feel that the show is maybe kind of boring, too slow, Daemon being stuck in Harrenhal for a long time. I do get some of those criticisms, but I'm going to talk more about kind of why the show is playing out the way it is a bit more after the last episode, because I want to see where all the pieces fall before I make kind of much of a judgment. There are some complex reasons for why the show takes the direction it does, partly because of how the book is written, and partly because of some interesting writing choices, which I'll cover in more detail after next episode. But I do want to know what you thought of the episode down below. I love talking about the world building and the writing side of things because that is my job. That is what I love doing. I've been doing it for a long time. I am a writer. I've got work published in magazines, have for years, published books, but I've also got books talking about writing and world building, like On Writing and World Building, which you can get down in the link below. I actually talk about Westeros, A Song of Ice and Fire, a fair amount in these books. In Volume 3, I talk about world building cities and towns, fallen civilizations, island civilizations, but also like writing character descriptions and death scenes. And I use a lot of George R.R. Martin's writing in these as examples. You can get Volume 2, which covers completely different topics, Volume 1. If you want to read my own book, my own stuff, a catalogue for the Inhumanity, which has a bunch of fantasy and sci-fi in it. And I reckon you would love that as well. It would mean a lot for me to be able to share that with you. Stay nerdy, the links are all down below, and I'll see you in the future.